Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of France, was a man of boundless ambition. By the early 19th century, he had conquered most of Europe. His armies were seemingly invincible, his enemies trembling before French might. Napoleon dreamed of a Europe united under his rule, a new Roman Empire with himself at its head. Yet one vast land remained unconquered, one nation stood defiant: Russia. Russia, a sprawling empire stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean, posed a unique challenge. Its sheer size, its vast population, and its unpredictable climate made it a formidable foe. Napoleon, however, remained undeterred. He believed that by defeating Russia, he could finally achieve his dream of European domination. The stage was set for a clash of titans, a conflict that would decide the fate of Europe. Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I were two sides of the same coin, both brilliant military minds and charismatic leaders. Yet their ambitions and ideologies set them on a collision course that would shape the destiny of Europe. Both men were visionaries, but their visions for the continent were starkly different, creating an inevitable tension. Their relationship was complex, a mixture of admiration, mistrust, and ultimately, rivalry. They recognized each other's strengths, but this recognition only deepened their mutual suspicion. Each saw the other as both a potential ally and a dangerous adversary. Initially, they attempted diplomacy, even signing a treaty in 1807. The Treaty of Tilsit was meant to establish a fragile peace, dividing Europe into spheres of influence. For a brief moment it seemed as though cooperation might prevail, but the treaty proved fragile, built on shaky foundations of mutual suspicion. Neither leader fully trusted the other, and their ambitions were too vast to coexist peacefully. The cracks in their agreement soon began to show. Napoleon saw Russia as a key obstacle to his grand plan for Europe. His vision of a unified continent under French dominance could not tolerate a powerful and independent Russia. To him, Alexander was a rival who needed to be subdued. He underestimated the Tsar's resolve, believing Alexander would yield to French pressure. This miscalculation proved fatal. Alexander was not a man to be easily intimidated, and his determination to protect Russia's sovereignty was unshakable. Alexander, deeply patriotic and unwilling to see Russia subservient to France, chose defiance. He saw Napoleon's ambitions as a direct threat to Russian independence and the balance of power in Europe. He rallied his people, preparing for the inevitable conflict. The Russian spirit of resistance was ignited, and the nation braced itself for the storm that was to come. The Tsar understood that facing Napoleon in a conventional battle was a risky proposition. The French army was a formidable force, and a direct confrontation could spell disaster for Russia. The French army was arguably the finest in Europe, renowned for its discipline and efficiency. Napoleon's military genius had forged an army that seemed almost invincible. Therefore, Russia adopted a strategy of attrition, designed to wear down the invading force. The scorched earth policy left the French army without supplies, forcing them to rely on dwindling resources. This strategy, combined with the vastness of Russia itself, aimed to sap the strength of the Grande Armée, turning the country into a trap for the French. The harsh Russian winter would become an unrelenting adversary. The clash between Napoleon and Alexander I was more than a simple clash of armies. It was a clash of ideologies, of visions for Europe. It was a battle of wills, with each leader determined to impose his vision on the continent. It was a battle between French dominance and Russian resistance, a conflict that would have far-reaching consequences for both nations and the continent they sought to shape. The outcome of this struggle would alter the course of history, leaving a legacy that endures to this day. In the summer of 1812, Napoleon unleashed the Grande Armée, an unprecedented military force numbering over 600,000 men, a coalition of soldiers drawn from across Europe. This vast army, a tapestry of nationalities from across Napoleon's empire, crossed the Niemen River, marking the start of the invasion of Russia. It was a moment of both ambition and foreboding, as the soldiers stepped into the unknown. Napoleon expected a swift campaign, a decisive victory that would bring the Tsar to his knees. Confident in his military genius, he believed the Russian forces would crumble under the might of his army. The initial advance of the French army was met with little resistance. Villages were eerily quiet, and the roads stretched endlessly ahead, offering no sign of the enemy. The Russians, adhering to their strategy of attrition, retreated deeper into their vast territory. They refused to engage in open battle, leaving the French to march further into the heart of Russia. They offered only token resistance, avoiding major confrontations, frustrating Napoleon's desire for a decisive engagement. The French soldiers, eager for battle, grew restless as the enemy remained elusive. This tactic, however, came at a cost. The Russians abandoned their homes and livelihoods, leaving behind ghost towns and barren fields. The Russians were surrendering their land, their cities, and their villages to the enemy. It was a sacrifice they deemed necessary to weaken the invaders. As the Grande Armée advanced, the Russians implemented a scorched earth policy, a strategy as devastating as it was effective. They burned crops, destroyed bridges, and poisoned wells, ensuring that the French army would find no sustenance or shelter in the lands they occupied. The once fertile Russian countryside was transformed into a desolate wasteland, leaving nothing but scorched earth in the wake of their retreat. The French, already facing logistical challenges due to the sheer distance from their supply lines, now faced starvation and disease. The morale of the troops began to waver as the hardships mounted. The Russian landscape, once a passive backdrop, was now an active participant in the conflict, slowly grinding down the invading force. The vast plains and unpredictable weather became as much an enemy as the Russian army. Despite the growing challenges, Napoleon pressed on, his determination unshaken. He believed that perseverance would lead to ultimate victory. Driven by his belief in his destiny and the strength of his army, he refused to consider retreat. To him, the campaign was a test of his will and his empire's power. He captured Smolensk, a strategically important city, but the victory proved Pyrrhic. The city was in ruins, offering little in terms of resources or morale. The Grande Armée was exhausted, its ranks thinned by hunger, disease, and desertion. The once mighty force was beginning to show cracks under the strain. The Russians, however, were far from defeated. They were biding their time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back with full force. They lured Napoleon deeper into their territory, drawing him into the vast, unforgiving expanse of Russia, where the true battle was yet to begin. The scorched earth policy, while brutal, proved devastatingly effective. This strategy, employed by the Russians, was not just a military tactic, but a psychological one. By denying the enemy the resources they needed to survive, it turned the vast Russian landscape into a barren, hostile expanse. The Grande Armée, accustomed to living off the land, found itself deprived of vital supplies. Fields were burned, wells poisoned, and villages abandoned, leaving the French soldiers with nothing to sustain themselves. The once fertile lands of Russia became a wasteland, offering no refuge. Hunger and disease ravaged the ranks, weakening the once mighty army. Soldiers, already fatigued from the long march, now faced the added burden of malnutrition and illness. The lack of proper medical care only exacerbated their suffering, turning minor ailments into fatal conditions. Morale plummeted as soldiers, facing an invisible enemy and a hostile landscape, began to doubt the wisdom of their emperor. The endless expanse of Russia seemed to stretch on forever, with no sign of relief or victory in sight. As if the scorched earth policy wasn't enough, the Russian winter, a formidable enemy in its own right, arrived earlier than usual. The biting cold and relentless snowstorms turned the campaign into a battle for survival, where nature itself seemed to conspire against the invaders. Temperatures plummeted, bringing with it blizzards and freezing winds. The once proud soldiers of the Grande Armée, unaccustomed to such extremes, found themselves at the mercy of the elements. Frostbite and hypothermia claimed lives as quickly as any battle. The French, ill-prepared for the harsh conditions, lacked adequate winter clothing and shelter. Their uniforms, designed for European climates, offered little protection against the biting cold. Makeshift shelters provided scant relief, and the soldiers' suffering grew with each passing day. Thousands perished from the cold, their bodies littering the frozen Russian landscape. The once organized columns of the Grande Armée disintegrated into scattered groups, each struggling to survive the unrelenting winter. The Russian army, accustomed to the climate and aided by the knowledge of the terrain, launched guerrilla attacks against the vulnerable French. These ambushes, though small in scale, were devastatingly effective, exploiting the French army's weakened state and further eroding their morale. These attacks, though small in scale, further demoralized the French, adding to the sense of despair that permeated the ranks. The soldiers, already battling hunger and cold, now faced an enemy that seemed to strike from the shadows. The Russian winter, combined with the ongoing scorched earth strategy, had become a weapon as deadly as any sword or cannon. It was a relentless force, sapping the strength and will of the invaders with every passing moment. The heart of Russia, once envisioned by Napoleon as the prize of his campaign, had become a frozen wasteland, swallowing his army whole. The dream of conquest turned into a nightmare of survival as the Grande Armée faced the harsh reality of their situation. The Grande Armée, once a symbol of French might, was now a shadow of its former self, decimated by hunger, disease, and the unforgiving Russian winter. The campaign, which began with such promise, ended in a devastating retreat, leaving behind a legacy of loss and suffering.